to your world. Let me see your face. Carry me away. Carry me away. Lift me from this place. Ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world. Let me see your face. Carry me away.
Hello and welcome to another SDAQ&A. I am your host for today, Peter Dixon, with my very special guest, Glenn Sackett. Great to have you with us, Glenn.
Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. Hey, we've kind of gotten to know each other a little bit online with the various groups that you've been talking into and discussing and having interesting discussions on. But this is the first time we've met face to face via video conferencing anyway. And one thing I'm looking forward to in this interview is we don't really know each other, but I like how I don't really prepare. I like to just have a conversation and we get to
I
know
love
each
that
other
too.
in real time and for everyone to
Yeah.
see and witness. So welcome everyone that's watching. Wow, we've got a good crowd watching already. That's fantastic. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Please get engaged with the conversation as well. Ask questions anytime that you like. We're going live to YouTube and here to Facebook. So please get involved with the conversation and please click that like button or the subscribe button. You've got no idea how much that really helps what I'm doing. The algorithms in Facebook and YouTube respond favorably if you've clicked like and subscribe. So lean forward now. It takes 1 second. Click that button. Glenn, we are going through an interesting week. The follow-up to that photo that was posted on the Adventist, I think Adventist Union site, the AUC. Tell me your first reactions from when you saw that photo, how it made you feel, and then I want to dig back a little bit into your history and what you've done in your life and how you've kind of been involved with impacting the role of women within the Adventist Church and employment, etc. So first up, what was your reaction when you saw that photo?
I was time warped.
Yeah.
I looked at that photo and I went like, what decade is this? What century is this?
Yeah. A lot of people
I
responded by saying, "Hey, look, these are great men."
Oh,
I
I'm
don't think,
sure they are.
I don't think we're referring to that, are we, when we're
No,
criticizing them?
no.
What do you think is what is deeper about the photo? What is deeply perhaps wrong with it?
I think if I were an editor, I would have not used the photo. I would have told the story some other way.
Yeah.
It's just it's not the way I would want to be perceived. And I'm assuming there are some women in ministry who were missing from that photo. Maybe they were some of the ones referred to as being virtually present. But it just says something about living in a different time and space than we are.
Mm. And in this part of the world, we like to think that we're quite progressive and have our
Yeah.
finger on the pulse. And I'm wondering whoever was in charge of marketing that pressed upload this picture and statement. What were they thinking? Were they
I would
intentional or
imagine they've
naive?
been surprised at the response.
Yeah. Hey, quick thank you to Terry Johnson, the AUC president, who has kept that post up, and it has allowed for the dialogue and the conversation to continue. And just to let people know that do watch the show, Terry has contacted me, and we're going to have a chat in a couple of weeks. And
Good.
maybe we might even be able to get Terry on the show. I also had a fantastic lunch yesterday with Gilbert Kanji, who used to be the SPD youth leader. Sorry, the GC youth leader, the global church
Yeah.
youth leader, and fantastic guy. And we had a brilliant lunch talking about this yesterday. And hopefully, we're going to get him on the program in a week or two as well. So yeah, there's obvious concern. There's people are there willing to have the conversation. I got sent lots of photos of I got sent a photo from lots of people showing a different meeting that was held the week before that was very inclusive with a number of women and men and people from all around the world represented in the photo. And they were saying it's a pity people didn't see this photo. But to me, it goes deeper than the photo, doesn't it?
Hmm.
There's something
It
deeper there.
does.
What do you think?
It's really about consciousness. If we can put a photo up like that, uh, and that occasions this kind of conversation, it means that there are different degrees of consciousness within the community.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think it's
right.
important when we have different degrees or uh, overlapping circles of consciousness to expand the conversation so that we understand each other better and so that we have a better sense of what the common ground is, what we share.
Yeah, yeah. Something came to light this morning that I read. It was written by one of the Adventist commissioned female pastors here in Australia, and it was printed in Adventist Today magazine.
Hmm.
And I'll need to double check this, but I'm pretty sure that the in the article she mentions that of those 23 men and the jobs they represent, only 10 would have been available to women based on the gender. I thought the stats were way
Oh.
lower than that. I thought the church is kind of saying, "Oh well, we still employ women in all various wonderful roles and positions," but that 10 out of the 23 they don't have access to based on gender. That starts to deepen my notion that this is discrimination based on gender.
Mm.
at a,
Hmm.
at a, at a way worse level than I thought. What do you think about that? Did you realize it was that endemic?
No, I didn't. I know there are quite a few positions that are based on ordination. I've never looked at the numbers of those.
Yeah, it surprised me.
And I really am puzzled that how it is that even in the progressive parts of the world church, that we still are so close to tokenism rather than actual mutuality or equity.
Yeah. Do you think the need?
Then
Do you
again,
think?
I think back, and the first two positions that I had as a chaplain, which is an ordained minister position, I would both of the first two places I was hired were groups of men as chaplains, and it was 1985, I think, when I became the director of the department in my second hospital, and I was the first. Uh, I hired the first female chaplain in all the Adventist Colorado hospitals.
Yeah. Did you get flack
So,
for that?
no,
No,
not really.
no.
No. No,
That's
I think it was recognized as appropriate and timely, and we had a very good person, Ginger Hanks Harwood, who's now at the La Sierra Women's Center. I'm not getting the title of that position right, I'm sure. Uh, but she was very, very good as a chaplain, but also she's good as a teacher and academic.
mm, mm. That's a good segue into telling us a little bit more about yourself. Who is Glenn Sackett? I like the adventurous nature of your personality that seems to be both literal and metaphoric. Can
It
you,
is.
yeah, tell us a little
I'm
bit about yourself?
I have a tremendous amount of curiosity. It shows up in whatever personality test I take. Curiosity comes out way high. And that's about the physical world. It's about the spiritual world. It's about the relationships, how relationships work, how communities work, how organizations work, how mechanical things work. I'm just curious about everything. I have no trouble understanding how we will enjoy eternity because I have an eternity full of questions and not enough time to get them all answered.
And
So
tell us a bit
I
about
think my
your,
curiosity has
sorry.
always taken me beyond the boundaries in which I find myself. There's always something on the edge that I don't know, and somehow I was never instilled with fear about going to the edge, uh, but always encouraged by artistic parents, by spiritually curious parents. My dad was a pastor who later became a chaplain, but he was a pastor, so he would be the obvious spiritual leader in my life. But my mom, who was a polio survivor, a doctor's daughter, parochial school teacher, and eventually Spanish teacher and special education teacher, I think of more as my chief spiritual influence in my growing up life.
So she had an important role to play in
She
your
did
development.
way before the bracelets with the WWJD came out.
Yeah.
Decades before that, she would say, "Well, what would Jesus do?" When I'd come to her with a question.
Interesting. Well, I
It was
like
a
that.
relational,
Yeah.
yeah. It wasn't a rule connection. It was a relationship
Yeah.
connection.
And your father, you're saying, was an actual pastor as
Yes,
well.
he
And when you,
was pastor of what was jokingly called the Northwest Wisconsin Conference. He had 7 churches.
it was a conference unto itself.
Yeah.
What, growing up, were you, there's a kind of Adventism which can be a little bit scary. Your probation might close any minute. You might be standing before God without an intercessor for a short time. You need to ensure that you have perfect character and a sinless nature before you can get into heaven. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that? Did you have that kind of an upbringing at all, even though your parents sound like they were quite lovely and accepting and loving?
Uh, y- yes, I heard plenty of that.
Right.
Like most pastors, my dad did some evangelistic series of meetings, and largely, like a lot of us were taught to do, borrowed from Fortis Dedimore's sermon notes or transcripts.
Yeah.
So even from my dad, I heard all the prophetic scary things. But I also saw a real contrast between the expectations that my parents had and the expectations of church members in conservative rural Wisconsin. Uh, and then later on, parochial school and the The smallest, most constricted space that I ever lived in was the academy dormitory, the boarding academy. That's where I found all of that fear and dread and uh, not looking forward to the judgment. It wasn't
No.
till later that I
Mm.
began to think like, oh, hey, judgment has a good side to it. the the people who are taken care of, they're covered, whose guilt has been removed. Judgment is a great thing because it takes the uncertainty away.
Yeah. One thing that concerns me with the Adventist teaching of judgment is that portrayal that you just said then, the taking away, the covering, the fighting on your behalf, the winning on your behalf. That's the story of the cross and the atonement at the cross. I've always
Yeah.
been, as I dug deeper, I've always thought, well, why do we need this additional kind of investigative judgment that came about 1844? I know we're straying from the topic, but what do you think Adventism at its very core and DNA has this leaning to kind of last generation theology and works and having to achieve a certain standard before you can enter heaven? Is it written into the code of Adventism? When it seems to me we've
Uh,
already got the cross and the atonement that clearly gives us the freedom and liberation that's all we need.
I I think it's written into our practices more than our DNA. I had the privilege of working at the White Estate at Andrews University when I was in seminary. And in that process, I did a lot of research in original documents. And I saw a different kind of Adventism portrayed in the early Review and Herald and these times. I saw a lively conversation. There was a lot of debate, and the kind of conversation that we got from that picture came from people's sermons, from articles that were written. There was a lively contest of ideas. And somewhere between the time that those things were written, which I think established, well, it really revealed to me how rich and diverse and on the edge our pioneers were.
Mm.
And I think that somewhere along the way, instead of perpetuating the spirit of the pioneers, which was adventuresome and ready to learn something new and ready to let go of the old things that were not quite there yet. We perpetuated their particular beliefs, and we somehow reduced the tension between differences down to a singular idea for most doctrines, and we latched on to that. Now I think what really pushed us farther in that direction is our recruiting method, which is directly, we wouldn't have said this, we wouldn't have recognized this, but we've directly targeted our recruiting to people who have a high degree of need for certainty, who don't like ambiguity, people who need things to be black and white. And so those are the kind of people we've attracted through the years, through the decades. And so as time goes on, I think the church becomes more and more like that. Except that our second and third generation folks in the church kind of look around and go like, wait a minute, things aren't quite that narrow. Things aren't quite that tight. Life is not black and white. It's a full color spectrum.
Yeah, yeah. And
And so the second and third generation Adventists keep the internal world a little wider than the portal that we bring people through into the church.
yes, that's a good point. In fact, I wish often that the leaders could, instead of selling what appears to be unity through uniformity, I wish they
Hmm.
could somehow sell Adventism as unity through diversity. I interviewed
Yes.
Michael W. Campbell the other day, and he's,
Hmm.
correct me if I'm wrong, those that are watching, he's just taken the position of head of archives at the North American division. And
Yes, I saw that today.
Yeah, and he was, I think, would agree with you that this kind of fundamentalist, more pinned down, legalistic form of Adventism really started galvanizing from 1920 onwards.
Hmm.
And we talked about questions on doctrine and how, in some ways, it was an attempt by the church to liberate from that way of thinking. But we often see a return to this kind of more fundamental legalistic approach, and often the top level leaders seem to be the ones that are wanting to bring it back. And at the
Hmm.
core of it, there seems to be a desire not to challenge the authority of Ellen White. Would you agree that maybe that's at the core of some of the problems we have today? That it's a one side is wanting to elevate Ellen White beyond what she intended, and the other side is willing to kind of look a little bit more openly at a variety of topics relating to that.
I think that's a continual tension, and it seems to me that in every generation, we have to revisit that. I came out of seminary just at the time of Walter Ray's book, just
Wow.
before Glacier View. That was a point of narrowing when question had come up, and there was a reflexive response to pinch it back down, make it narrow. I kind of
Yeah.
laugh because my ordination was not a given. Uh, at the time I became a chaplain, I was not yet ordained. I was still an intern in the conference. And when I accepted the call to chaplaincy, no chaplain had ever been ordained. It was understood that you got ordained as a pastor and then you could become a chaplain. And my conference president said to me when I accepted the call, he says, "You realize that you're not going to get ordained." And I said, "Well, that's God's problem, not mine."
And lo and
So
behold,
a couple years
yeah,
later, the conference president invited me to an ordination committee, and that was after Glacier View, and the screws were tightened really tight on everybody. And the first person to the committee that day was scheduled for an hour, and by at 8 o'clock by lunchtime they weren't done with him. And and in fact, he was not approved for ordination. So when I went in and they asked me the question, "What do you think of Ellen White?" I knew, they'd ask some other questions first, but they
mm,
were, nothing questions. They were get acquainted questions.
yeah,
That one
yeah,
I knew was a big one.
yes, there was
And
strings attached to that one.
yeah, and I I thought back to what I'd told the conference president of my pastoring conference. This is God's problem, and I thought, okay, this is my chance to just tell it like it is and see how it goes. So I said, well, I believe Ellen White was inspired. And one of the things that she tells me and all of us is don't take my books into the pulpit. Don't preach from what I say, preach from the Bible. So I said, I study the Bible first, I study Ellen White second, I write my sermon outline, and I go into the pulpit with the Bible. I do not take the red books with me. So I said, if that's okay with you, then we're fine. If you think that that means that to be a Ellen White supporter means that I have to preach from what she said, um, that's we got a problem.
Yeah.
And they were fine.
That's fascinating because I
Yeah.
that you were being very honest and authentic and transparent there.
Hmm.
A lot of people have tried to play the game of once they've been asked euphemistic style questions, they respond euphemistically,
Yeah.
um, and the game continues. But you were very forward there. Do you remember who was on the committee that was interviewing you that day?
Joel Tompkins was the president of the Kansas Nebraska Conference. And I remember that there were about uh, three other pastors and two lay members from the conference committee. I don't remember all their names. But I know it included somebody from the Union College, or two people from the Union College community, because Lincoln is the biggest Adventist center in that conference.
Right. So
Yeah.
just two things that are related and unrelated, but because we're having a conversation, I'm always fascinated when I chat to people that were at that era, late 70s, early 80s, where the whole Glacier View, Des Ford thing went down and exploded into the church, and many young pastors were met with stay or leave based on this kind of line in the sand. Just tell us a little bit about that time period. What was it like on campus? What was it like working for the church? I just want you to unpack a little bit more some of your thoughts to paint a clearer picture for us of what it was like. I was too young at the time to fully know what was going on. I just noticed lots of young youth leaders leaving and going from the church.
Yeah. I saw a lot of my pastor colleagues leave. As a matter of fact, not long after that, I think maybe 5 years after Glacier View, I saw a statistic that said only 20% of my seminary class was still in Adventist ministry.
Wow.
Only 20%.
Now, would that be a higher that's a higher fallout than just your normal kind of
Yes,
expectation? Yeah, because
much higher. Yeah.
some leaders have tried to suggest, well, that's just a normal culling of the pack.
No, that's not normal.
Yeah.
Uh, One of the things I really appreciated about seminary was that I learned to think at a higher level than I had at in undergraduate school. I suppose that's true in most professions. Otherwise, we wouldn't need that extra education. It's not just learning more; it's learning differently,
Yes.
and
Learning
it
how to
was
learn.
more learning how to think.
Mm,
Still, still some more of what to think, but a lot more of how to think.
mm,
How to rightly divide the word of truth.
mm.
How to discern sources, how to discern biases in sources. I hadn't been taught that at undergraduate level.
Mm,
And so, having been taught to think like that, and then going through the reactionary period that included Glacier View, was a kind of a mental whiplash, even a spiritual whiplash. It was like spirituality had been in a growing experience for us, for my generation, and then all of a sudden it went, ooh, got really narrow. I have
mm.
somewhere in one of my boxes, I have a little artifact. It is, the legal pads of paper that are, 8.5 by 11.
Yeah.
Well, somebody took one of those and cut it into half-inch wide strips, and they called this a scratch pad for narrow-minded people. And that's what it felt
Mm.
like at that time, is that we were
Mm.
given this little, maybe
Yeah.
you've seen this also from the 70s, when we had complaint departments, or complaint mechanisms in organizations where people could make complaints. I saw a big poster one time that was probably a foot and a half by 3 feet, and in the middle it had a little 1 inch square, like the clergy collar, and it says, "Please give us your complaint. Write it here."
I like it. So they were kind of saying, yes, we encourage you to think, but
Yeah,
we're restricting the
but
parameters
put it here.
of that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what it felt like.
Did you ever meet Des Ford or get to hear him speak live?
I did somewhere. Yes, I can't remember where it was now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your general impression of people like Ford and Brinsmead and Cottrell and these guys that were kind of seeming to be dissidents and radicals?
Um, I don't think I ever met Brinsmead, and what I read and heard from Brinsmead, I felt differently about than I did Ford.
Mm,
To me, Des Ford was very spiritual, very gospel oriented, He was a bit less of a storyteller than Morris Venden, but Desford and Morris Venden were the people who were expanding and sharpening and clarifying my spiritual life at the time.
Mm,
Desford did it through a studious approach, and Morris Venden did it through wonderful storytelling
mm, mm,
and marvelous illustrations
mm.
that for a visual person really worked well.
Yes, yeah, I've heard his name mentioned often.
Now I understood um, that church organizations um, certainly will respond to what they label as or think as heretical teachings or incorrect teachings, uh, but they are even more likely to respond to financial challenges that come from uh, new people, new groups, new ideas.
Mm,
And I don't know where I got the impression, but I got the impression that alongside Ford's teachings that some people had a hard time with, there was more of a fear that the church would lose financially if his ministry grew.
mm,
Now I don't
mm,
know why, but that's just one of the factors
mm,
that I think may have played into that. I
mm.
I was sick about Glacier View.
Yes, yeah. It was seemed very underhanded. Now, by the way, welcome to the Facebook group SDAQ&A. You're a member as of this morning. And
Yes, thank you.
feel free to go back. Our whole second season is
I will
digging
do that.
deep into the
Yeah,
Glacier View and Des Ford, and we're interviewing everyone from Fritz Guy to Larry Geraghty to Bill Johnson to many of
I
the
looked at the
players that were
list.
there. Yeah,
Fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think you'll enjoy it. I'm a bit of a novice interviewer at that stage, and hopefully, I haven't damaged the wonderful resource that is there, but I've certainly was front row and center, having an incredible education. So yeah, I encourage you to go back and have a look at that. Now, let's dive back
thank
into
you.
women's ordination. I want to try and create this. Some people feel like, oh, this is just being raised now, and let's research this from a biblical
Mm.
perspective. And well, the fact is that even before 2015 and the no vote, there was a lot of research done leading up to that. But take us back again to the 70s, 60s, 70s. Was women's ordination on the table back then, and was there research being done into the biblical take on women's ordination, etc.? See, a lot of people say, "Well, why ordain at all?" And I'd probably agree with that. But when you use, but when you
Well,
use ordination as a
yeah.
weapon against a minority, or as a weapon against, or a weapon to keep people out of something, that's when it does
Mhm.
become an important topic. So, just tell us a little bit about the time period like of, say, 60s, 70s for women's ordination. What was going on back then?
I don't know much about the 60s. I was still in school, still in college, graduated in 70 from Southwestern Adventist Union College.
Can I
Had
just
been
ask?
to Union College too.
Can I just ask a quick
Pardon?
question? Can I just ask a
Yeah.
quick question there? Sorry to interrupt, but when you mentioned
Yeah.
southern, did you say?
Southwestern,
Oh, southwestern.
Texas.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you said southern. I had a question
No,
about southern, but sorry. Carry on. Go ahead.
no, you'll have to ask Richard Erickson about that. I saw his name in the group. He and I were
Oh,
roommates in college.
oh, really? Now
Yeah.
he went on. Is that the Richard that went on to start his own church?
No,
Left.
this is well, at least
Oh, yes.
I
Sorry.
didn't
Yeah,
look at the picture, but the
yeah.
Richard that I
I,
know
I know
grew
who
up
you
in the
mean.
Carolinas, and he
Yes.
teaches. I think he's retired now too, but
Yes.
he taught economics and accounting
That's right.
at
I
Southern.
I remember. I remember. Very
Yeah,
interesting interview. I really enjoyed that. So he was your roommate.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh, you'll enjoy that interview.
yeah.
So share with us then from the 70s on your just
Well,
again
at
create a
seminary,
scene of what it was
I
like.
was in seminary from 70 to 72, graduated 73 after finishing already, a few months before. It was discussed at that time, but it wasn't a hot topic, and it was recognized as something that we would need to find a way to talk about and to figure out what we wanted to do, what was the right thing to do. But I can't remember any specific pro or con people
No.
in the seminary at this time. It was at a low level of interest, but it was on the radar.
And perhaps was there a sense of optimism that men and women and leaders
Yeah,
and would get together and bring about equality and a better
right.
climate for individuals.
Yeah, and I would say that was my experience through the 70s. That the window seemed to be opening a little more, like the window in the picture behind you. We in the spring we opened the windows, and it felt like spring
Really?
in that sense, even though there were other things that were down in that time. It I had some optimism. I had in my very first church experience, intern pastor in San Antonio. Uh, my wife and I had one child, and we lived in the 5-bedroom parsonage of the church. And we didn't need all that room, so we rented one of the bedrooms out to, or, yeah, a bedroom and some other room out to a clinical pastoral education student, a woman who was a pastor's wife who was studying to be a chaplain. And just watching her develop her ministry and transition from being a pastor's wife to being a minister in her own right was a fascinating thing to experience. And I just was uh, very positively impressed that she, in fact, was more competent and better able to minister to people and to connect people and to help them in their spiritual journey than her husband was. I felt of that pair, not necessarily every pair, but of that pair, she was the strength. And I watched her become a chaplain, get hired as a chaplain, and eventually the two of us interviewed for the same position, um, which she was offered first but didn't take, and then I got it. So we were colleagues for a long time.
Yeah.
And I saw that happening in many places where there were women who had been recognized or were being recognized as having the gifts of ministry, who were stepping into the role, and they were surprising people.
Yeah.
And yeah, there'd be my experience, even in conservative Texas, was that yeah, there's a few people who are misogynistic and went like, no, I would not have a woman as my pastor. But that was
Yeah.
a minority.
Yeah.
And
That
so it was a church problem, not a personal problem. That was way
yeah.
before the culture wars started.
Yes. This optimism that you're speaking of, that's kind of when I started getting more involved and growing up and being more aware of what was going on. So through into the 80s, perhaps. Um,
Hmm.
I sensed this optimism as well. Um, and I think I'm interested in your thoughts at where, because when that picture was posted, I'll just quickly put up Peter Marx's just written something there. I think that was Peter Marx. It's a while back. Yeah, Peter wrote this. This is, I think, just confirming what we were talking about, the 10 positions. There are 9 in that photo that we're talking about. There are 9 conference presidents and 1 union president, making 10 positions that are not available to women by current policy. There are 14 general secretaries, CFO, or secretary treasurers, which is just confirming that in that picture, 10 positions are not available to women.
Yeah.
And here we are now. So let's say 1972, you're birthing into an Adventism that seems to be flourishing. There's some really great new concepts floating around with Des Ford and Righteous by Faith. Still possibly some positive vibes floating off of questions on doctrine. We can see some ugliness starting to rear its head, but generally speaking, with regards to women in ordination and in ministry, there's a positivity. That positivity
Hmm.
I sensed also from 82 onwards.
Hmm.
92, I started noticing some struggles, occurring with theology and whatnot, but there still seemed to be a positive air continuing through. Somewhere between
During that
92 and now,
time,
yeah.
during that time, my parents moved to Colorado from Hawaii, and it wasn't too long after they came here that my mom was in the first group of women who were ordained as elders in local church in
Oh,
Colorado.
what year was
And
that?
so that was part of my optimism. I think that was mid 80s.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's confirming
Uh,
this optimistic theory that I've got.
yeah,
So it feels like that from 72 to 92,
maybe
lots
late
of
80s.
positivity. Yeah. So we come from somewhere between 92 to 2000, 2022, and we have that photo, and we have a huge outpouring of, I'd almost say, anger from women that have seen this photo, from men that have seen this photo that are supporting equality of opportunity, etc. I'm trying to work out where in that period did things become optimistic. Was it the no vote of 2015, or was it brewing before then?
Oh, it was before that.
Right. Well, I'd
That
love to
was
hear your
it was
thoughts on
brewing
where and
before
when.
that. Um, I would say I became really active in the discussion and got involved in the mid 80s. As I said, became director of the largest chaplaincy service in Colorado in the Adventist world in 1985. And within a couple of years, hired the first woman chaplain here.
Mm,
And so we were also a training center for chaplains of multiple denominations, not just Adventists. So I was
really?
surrounded by really solid women in ministry and women learning ministry, and I
Mm,
became a mentor to all chaplains. But I particularly noticed that women preparing for ministry had far less mentorship than the men did. So I turned my attention to that and determined that that was a role that I could fulfill, and I was happy to do that. I
mm,
think my mother's influence on me as being the real primary spiritual relationship force in my life must have had some impact on that.
mm.
1988, I think it was, I was elected as president of the Seventh-day Adventist Healthcare Chaplains Association, and immediately identified my top priority to talk with the group about, which is we had already been a part of conversation for a long time, but my priority became to get the whole group to be active during the let's see, during the 7 years I had already been in the organization. We had come from a place where there were maybe two or three out of 40 chaplains that were women to the place where about 25% of the chaplains were women by 1989. And it was really becoming a touchy and sore issue. Uh, this is really interesting. Chaplains don't get those carefully parsed questions. A,
Mm,
a chaplain walks into the room, and a patient who's of who knows what faith or no faith at all looks up and sees the chaplain and has questions. Why are you here? And the question that women chaplains got asked that men chaplains never got asked is, are you real? Are you a real minister? I
Really?
mean, are you ordained? And it was just that straight and that blunt, and it
Wow.
hurt.
Yeah.
I saw
Yeah.
the hurt in
Questioning
the
the
eyes and the
validity.
voices.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Questioning their validity based on the gender, essentially.
yeah. And
Wow.
they struggled with that. And we would affirm them, but when a patient questions you like that, and
Yeah.
they're trying to decide how much spiritual authority to give you, that's a very difficult place to be.
That is.
And so I said, what is it? What's going on here where God is calling these people to ministry? I have no question about that. The call came to them like it came to me. I couldn't tell anything fundamentally different about it. And it wasn't about women's rights, it wasn't about equality. It was, God called me to do this, God equipped me to do this. Here I am, and people are questioning whether I'm real or not.
Yeah.
And I said, how can this be? How can it? So I made that a priority of the group. By 1989, the next year, I had sat down with my chaplain colleague that I'd hired, and we had written a statement of support for ordaining women in ministry that the SDA Chaplains, Healthcare Chaplains Association voted and passed it around, and there's 40 signatures on that. And we sent it to the General Conference through our Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries office. So, and every year after that, for many years, we voted it again and again and sent the message up the chain that this is important. By that time, the Seventh day Adventist Healthcare Chaplains Association, if it had been named a conference, would have been one of the largest conferences in the North American division. There were 100 of us.
Wow.
There were only 2 or 3 conferences that had that many pastors in them.
Boy. That's a force to be reckoned with. How
Yeah.
how did the leaders respond to that
I
influential
basically
bunch?
ignored it. They ignored it. It wasn't a big fight at the time. But
Right.
here's the interesting perspective. As we advocated for that over time, what we noticed every time it came up at General Conference, each 5-year period, the percentage of votes in favor of whatever the proposition was related to ordaining women went up. And we could see them going up and up and up. And we said, at one point, I remember we said, either next time or the following time, uh, there's just enough turnover in the delegates that we're going to be there. So let's make sure that we're strong in advocacy, but that we're not creating trouble in the process. And
Right.
it was between that and the next general conference when the American culture wars just blew up, and when the internet showed up and made
Mm. Mm.
uh, alternate voices easily accessible,
Mm.
and so now all of a sudden it went the other direction. And by
And what year do you think that was
2010,
roughly? Yeah. Just tell me a parameter of time that you think that was happening in.
um,
You're saying, look,
2005, we were optimistic. We were expecting that it would,
right.
that by 2010 or 15 it would become a practice.
Wow.
And
So
then
that's fascinating.
2010, the inaugural speech of the newly elected president prophesied a self-fulfilling
Mm.
prophecy that things were going to narrow down, and
Mhm.
that was where the definition of unity as uniformity was declared.
Yes.
And I went like, oh, really?
Yeah.
How can this be?
Yeah,
Um,
I'm so glad you're unpacking this because this is putting it into perspective, particularly for young people that are watching and particularly young women
mhm.
that are watching. Um, there seems to be a sense of, what's going on? There's nothing to see here. Come on, guys, it's going to be okay. Then this photo's posted, and what people like myself, you, many that are angry about this photo and what it represents. Not the men in the photo, not that it's an
No,
Australian photo, none of that. But what it
no,
represents is that we're kind of indicating that from, say, 2010, 2012 to now, there's been a downhill trajectory. There's less optimism.
yes,
And what people don't
yes,
realize is that we see that photo as endemic of 40, 50, 60 years of this
hmm
as possible movement upwards, and now a
hmm
decline in it. So we feel
yes.
that this photo represents optimism, and and why do you think that so many people are still speaking optimistically about this? I've fielded so many behind the scenes emails
hmm
and messages from leaders and from women and men saying, "Oh, but I think it's going to change," and they've got the optimism of someone living in the 70s and 80s, but the empirical data that suggests otherwise. Where is this optimism coming from that I'm not sort of seeing?
um, I don't know. You know Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled?
Yes, yeah, read
Yeah,
all his works,
yeah.
including People
I
Are for
knew him
Life.
well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we brought him to Porter Hospital several years in a row at the peak of his publishing career and had
Wow.
him talk with professional audiences.
Mm,
And he did a community building workshop with us, which was
right.
several days. Anyway, he has given the very best definition of transference, the phenomenon of transference I've ever heard, read, seen. He said
Yeah.
transference is using the wrong map to navigate the territory.
Oh, wow, that is good.
So, what it usually means is that we're carrying an old map from previous experiences into a new experience, and we're not recognizing that the new experience is different. So, we're still trying to navigate with the old map.
Wow, that's gold.
Now, for those young people who don't know maps and compass work, the GPS is the same. In the early days of the GPS, there were lots of errors in the maps. And I remember an executive team Christmas party at our hospital in our hospital community that half of us didn't get to because our GPS maps could not find the location
Mm.
of the place where the party was being held. Some of us went back to our maps and compasses and found our way there before the party was completely over, but some people never got there.
There at all.
And I
Yeah.
think this is what's happening is that we still feel the optimism because for so many decades we saw the progress, and that's deep in our experience.
Mm, mm.
But the communication world and the I'm gonna I'm gonna bring in one more topic here. We live in a post-truth era. You know, for a long time we had progress in learning and discovering truth, and we had progress in being able to discern truth and sort out sources, and we got better and better about we even demanded better from our news people,
Mm,
and then with the internet and with dishonest politicians primarily, but also dishonest advertising in the economic world,
and media.
false promises and alternative facts and factoids that are factually true in a very narrow sense, but paint a very deceptive picture
Mm,
in the big picture, have become prominent. And it was funny because postmodernism started out in the academic world as a reaction to a black and white worldview.
mm.
But with the internet and these other sources, postmodernism quickly became a tool of the uneducated and the anti-intellectuals and spread like wildfire. They would have
Mm,
never spread like that from academia.
mm, mm, mm.
And so we have To me, the biggest problem in Adventism isn't not ordaining women, although that's the most visible problem. The problem is that we have regressed and we have um, distorted badly the whole concept of inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so that the Bible has now become a tool of the deceptive to overwhelm and to attack careful thinking and scholarship.
Mm, mm,
And it's gained a tremendous amount of power in that way. And it depends on really and not Adventist, not a true Adventist understanding of
mm,
inspiration.
mm.
And I
This,
think until or unless we correct that, we're going to have a lot of issues besides this one that we're going
mm,
to struggle with because we've got radically different ideas of what the Bible is and how it's to be used and
mm,
what Ellen White, what the place, the role, the authority of Ellen White is.
mm. You mentioned when you were at the White Estate during your internship or early years studying that you saw kind of what I call some gems of Adventism that I think have not truly ever been revealed. I think there's an Adventism that could have been or could be that still has never been
Yeah.
seen. And I think the problem is that those who see it, and I've seen it in all the interviews I've done, every now and again I just see a glimpse of it. And I think the problem is that those who do see it aren't organized, they're not coordinated, they have no leadership. And so it does actually flourish. I did an interesting interview with Tom
Yes.
Norris, and he worked also with the Heloviac. I've just forgotten his first name, but in the archives there at the GC, I think. And he discovered this kind of different Adventism, this gem that wasn't perhaps portrayed and hasn't been portrayed. I
Hmm.
I think too that so if we look back to this photo of the 23 men in this photo that we're talking about today, I know that 50% of them are supportive of women's ordination. There seems to be an element of fear getting up and saying that publicly, and so they euphemistically say, "Well, we support women in ministry." Um,
Hmm.
but the audience, their flock, the people that they are responsible for offering pastoral care, want to hear them say something a bit more true. But part of the reason I think that they are behind the scenes saying to me, "We support women's ordination," and publicly they're not, and they're also saying to me things are going to change, is because they're looking at the old map that was clearly presented through the 70s and 80s and 90s that seemed to be taking us in a direction that was positive. They still are looking at that map going, I can't work out why I'm turning left and it's the wrong mountain here. And they're still looking at that old map. Ted Wilson has clearly placed the map of where he wants Adventism to go in clear sight, has been super clear about it over the last 12 years, and has put in place the
Hmm.
compliance document into policy. He's warned 6 unions to turn around or they're going to be reprimanded. Sanctions will follow. His map is
Hmm.
so clear. And that's why I personally, in my humble opinion, said with much love, feel there's a high probability that his map is proving to be a successful guidepost for the more fundamental Adventists that are following his leadership, and that the probability that he or one of his ilk will return here when the votes happen in June or July or whenever it is. Is that resonating with you at all? Is there some truth to this idea that I love what you said about the transference and the and the map? That's gold. Are our leaders, the ones that are seen in that picture and the metaphor of that picture, are they following the old map? Do they not see what Ted Wilson is doing so clearly and effectively?
I think there are not too many people who are comfortable saying what they see. Uh, I think before 2010, it was okay to say what you thought.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could pass an ordination committee today. I really don't.
Yeah.
um, the Oh, I lost my train of thought there.
Well, I'm just
So
talking about the
go back to
maps.
your question.
Just the leaders seem to be following this old map. Ted
Oh,
Wilson has this new map. Well, he has a map that some would even say is an original map, but he's getting people back to a kind of golden era Adventism that I think is really this 20s, 30s, 40s Adventism. But he's got a
that's
map
the
of how
other
to get
time
back
warp
there.
that I
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
I experience a time warp whenever I listen to him preach or talk.
yeah.
It's American English of the 1950s
Yes,
or
yeah.
even 40s. Um, and it's Fortis Dedamore sermons
Yeah, I know.
all
You
over again.
when you mentioned him earlier, he came here to
And I love
Kurumbong.
Fortis Dedamore. He's he's a great guy, but he lived a long time ago.
I know. I was just
Yeah.
saying that he came to Kurumbong here when I was about 16, 17, and did a big,
Hmm.
evangelistic program for a week, and for months before he came, I'm talking about 9, 10 months, there was a big sign plastered on our main street at the entrance to the church property, "Detamore is coming." And I've still got a
Yeah.
book of his evangelistic sermons this thick of
Oh, I have that
transcriptions.
too. In
It's
fact, I used those when I was doing my first evangelistic
yeah.
series. I used those and I used my dad's.
Well, so I
Because
guess my
when you do
question
an evangelistic series, you don't have time to write your own sermons. There just isn't time for
you're just reading other people's material.
that.
So I
Yeah.
guess my question is, like a lot of the leaders are saying to me, "We don't think Ted's going to get back in." Um, what I think they're following this old map. Um, What are your thoughts on that? Because what we talked about, generally speaking, the optimism. It seems to have flagged. Why is it
Well,
not
let's
flagging
start.
for them? What do they know that they're not? What secret weapon have they got? What strategy up their sleeve have they got? When at every point they're just being, it's empirically shown to not be an accurate perception.
Let me start with this. It's really hard to predict the future because it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know that I even want to try to go there.
But if you're
I
if you're
I
suggesting that
think
there's a map and that some people
I
are
think it's
following the
wishful
wrong map,
thinking.
you can indicate that if you follow this map, you are going to be able to predict the future of where they're going to end up. They're not going to end up at the party
Yeah.
that they should be ending up at if they follow that map. So are we
Yeah.
looking at potentially, I'm not wanting to put you on the spot, but potentially are people not realizing the entrenched um, leadership model that is in place at the moment, um, and how powerful it
I think
actually
it's
is?
fairly well recognized where I live.
Right.
I think your part of the world is the exception in the southern hemisphere.
Interesting.
And to me, um, the big shift that is also behind this is that the developing world is now the dominant force in the church, not the developed world. And the developing world is where Adventism is growing by leaps and bounds. And it is the people that we have most recently recruited. They're still in their first generation of being Adventists. They're mostly black and white thinkers. And they were attracted to the Adventist church because we taught them in a way that they can recognize as making sense. It makes life more understandable to them when it's all laid out in these nice little prophetic charts and this 28 fundamentals. How can you have 28 fundamentals of anything? Fundamentals means what I can count on my hand.
Yes, exactly.
But we do that and it attracts a certain kind of
Mm,
people. And now we have a majority of people in the church who are in the southern hemisphere, the developing part of the southern hemisphere, and the leadership is the kind of leadership that makes sense to them, and the map that has been in place in and technically, I don't use the word leadership for that. It slips into my vocabulary once in a
Mhm.
while. I call it church officials.
Right.
The church officials are creating a map that makes sense to the developing world of
Yes.
Adventism.
Yeah. Okay.
And because the developed world of Adventism of Australia, North America, Europe, um, is now smaller in numbers, and it doesn't matter as much. And even I don't know what it's like in Australia, but even in North America, the church is still growing, but it's only growing among immigrants, recent immigrants in minority population. And I think there's been a calculation that as long as the world church is growing by leaps and bounds like it is, it's better to sacrifice this liberal bunch
Mm-hmm.
and their ilk than it is to jeopardize the growth in the
Yes.
developing world where the opportunity is.
And I think that's why the leaders down in this part of the world aren't speaking publicly into this because they know that will go against what the leadership at the top is saying,
Yeah,
and they don't
and the
want to slip
leadership
into what is becoming a minority view.
to to make it even more clear. Church officials have stated clearly that in terms of the shaking, that they're willing to split the church over
Yeah.
ordaining women, which to me goes back to an arbitrary decision that was made, which I think was very unfortunate, which is that the issue has to be decided on uniformity across and around the world field. There was no logical, no spiritual, no biblical reason for it to be that way. That was
Mm,
just an arbitrary decision that was made. We've made accommodations for all kinds of cultural and regional differences in many other ways. The Jerusalem Church Council decided that it was okay for Jews to be circumcised and to observe the old Jewish rules, but it was not okay to impose those on the Gentiles, which were the place of opportunity for the church growth.
yeah,
And so,
interesting.
why didn't we follow the example of the Jerusalem Council and
Mm,
say,
yeah,
let each world field, let each field in the world decide
yeah,
how to support and increase the effectiveness of ministry according to what is most effective in their
exactly.
area?
And that's why Ellen White helped set up the unions. So they
Yes,
so they could, work
yes.
within the culture of their location.
Which, by the way, is an interesting thing. And historically, there was a time in the 70s and 80s when some of us would have been happy to get rid of the unions because
Yes,
they had
I
become
remember.
the seat of power.
Yeah,
Constitutionally, they had become the seat of power, and there was some progress being inhibited by the union conference presidents and the power that they held.
yes,
And so there was an economic reason and a power reason to consider dissolving those unions. I'm really, really glad now that we didn't get rid of them because without the unions, we'd be even more regressive now
yeah,
than we
yes,
are.
yeah. So when I said earlier that I think based on this, what did you call it? Leadership. What was your
Church
term?
officials,
The church officials. The church
official
officials.
declarations and actions
When we
by
observe
people
them,
in those positions.
when we observe the map clearly presented from those church officials, I feel that I have grounds to say the probability is high that they will achieve the goals that they are hoping for, and that Ted Wilson or his ilk will get into power. like you said, that hasn't happened. The future hasn't been written. What's something positive we can say into the conversation that gives people hope that maybe we can head this off at the pass? Oh, did you hear that? It's massive thunder.
I heard something, but I don't
Yeah.
know what it was.
Hopefully we don't get cut off. Wow. Sorry, carry
Well,
on.
I'm going to quote Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them.
I like that. Mm,
That's part of where I see hope.
mm,
I think we got into this. Um, we got into the conversation about women in ministry honestly and forthrightly, with an eye towards the future and an understanding that culture changes slowly and will change with it.
yes.
Um, it won't automatically change, so we need to advocate. And I soon discovered as I became an advocate that there were things I could do that were more effective than advocacy, although I've continued that. It was more important for me to mentor women in ministry. It was more important for me to hire women in ministry. It was more important for me to be a connector in the terms of the tipping point, um, than a content expert, because by connecting women with other people who were hiring chaplains or hiring pastors, I could help the process without fighting the opponents.
Mm,
And so, and another thing that really became clear to me from the beginning, well, not the very beginning, but when we first wrote our declaration of support for women in ministry, there was a mixture of biblical and ministry reasons for women in ministry with the advancement of the whole field of attention to human rights and women's rights and women's liberation. And when those things got mixed in there together, it got more complicated.
yeah,
And
okay.
so the preamble sentence to our declaration of support for women in ministry was very clear. It was based out of our experience as chaplains having the largest percentage of women in ministry anywhere in the Adventist world. We said, from our experience in working as colleagues and being blessed by the women in our collegial circle, we have the evidence that God has called them to ministry and that it is our opportunity to support them.
Yeah, that's a
We took it from an experiential point of view, from a ministry point of view, and we left out all the secular reasons to do it because we thought that really had little chance of being effective in a church that claims to be based on biblical truth.
yes, yeah. That's a great preamble. Um, do you think that in part there was an opportunity there for like you mentioned your mother was one of the first women to be ordained as an elder. Do you think there was an opportunity there for the church to ordain women chaplains as another step forward, but still to kind of keep the precious ordination of pastors separate to that?
Well, at the time, chaplains were ordained and credentialed by local conferences. In
I
that way,
see.
even though we had the experience and the evidence that it was appropriate and timely
I
and
see.
would increase the effectiveness, we still were in that pattern. And there was a good reason for it because chaplains can become easily separated from the conference and become unknown to the conference. And there are other reasons that we should be connected. That's now changed because chaplaincy became the new great opportunity for enlarging ministry at the
Yeah.
expense of secular organizations rather than having to raise more tithe to get
Yeah.
more ministers. And when
Yes.
that happened, we needed more advocacy and more formal sponsorship. And so the Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries office of the General Conference and later the North American Division were developed. And so now the ordination of chaplains and the certification of or the ecclesiastical endorsement of chaplains comes from the North American Division for us in the world, the General Conference office of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries in the rest of the world.
Right.
So now we have the structure that might be able to do that, but we don't have, we are now living in the restricted map.
Yes, the officials won't let it happen. One thing that surprised me also since the photo was released is a lot of people are saying, well, we're now finally starting to do some research into what the Bible says about ordination. And as I alluded to earlier, the church has been doing Bible study into this for many decades. What have you found from your personal study of the Bible to because the officials are using the Bible to confirm that women shouldn't be ordained? Where are they wrong with that? And in your personal journey looking at the Bible, how have you seen women that have? How would you justify the ordination of women based on the Bible?
My primary theological principle on that is what Jesus said: if they're not against us, they're for us. And the apostles got into a conversation about this too, and also the apostles with Jesus, when someone was doing some work, but they weren't official. And Jesus, that's where Jesus said, if they're not for us, or if they're not against us, they are for us. But the apostles later on said, um, sort of the by their fruits you shall know them. If God is in it, it will succeed. If God is not in it, it won't. And
Yeah.
there's plenty of evidence in the gospel and early church story that we have in what we call the New Testament that says that there were women in ministry
Mm,
before there was such a thing as ordination.
mm,
And we don't have a theology of ordination. We have a practice of ordination. We've propped up our practice of ordination, which has been largely shaped by American tax revenue principles. We've propped it up with Bible texts, but it's not a good theology. And the
mm.
TOSC task force, the previous task force,
Yes.
the one before that, they all acknowledged that we don't have a good theology of ordination and that our practice, even separate from the question of ordaining women, is not a good systematic theology.
Mm,
It's a practice.
mm. Boy, that's another interesting insight. I'm glad you've shared that.
Yeah. So there are texts that can be taken out of context that you can use to say women should not be ordained, but when you put it all together, there's no prohibition of it. There's no direct support for it. It's a matter of how we understand the gospel and how we understand the commission to ministry
Mm,
and how we understand the work of God. I although I've been a chaplain for 40 some years, I've also preached regularly, approximately once a month. And a few years ago, I put myself in a discipline because it's really easy to sort of follow your own interests in preaching, especially if you don't have one congregation that's tracking you. And so I gave myself a discipline. I said, I'm going to preach through the Bible. I'm going to make myself preach from Genesis to Revelation, and I'm going to look for what are the big central themes, and is there a central theme? And I came to the realization as I went through that, it didn't take me very long to find the central theme is God doesn't change, but God continually changes tactics and approaches and ways of working with humans. As we humans find new ways of leaving God behind or leaving God out of our lives or even turning against God, God keeps finding new ways to invite us back. And that's what ministry is. Whether it's called prophetic ministry or pastoral ministry, God is continually, through the Bible story, inventing new ways to get to people's hearts and inviting them back to the way.
Mm.
And I just can't see why we should stop inventing new ways to make ministry more effective at the end of the writing of the New Testament.
Mm. Yes, someone has written a big hearty yes to that in the comments. Um,
And again, that comes back to what map are we using? Do we have to use the same map over the whole world of practices?
mm, mm,
You know, our core theology, yes. Ellen White talked about the importance of having a common core theology,
mm,
but she also talked about the importance of leaving everything else open. We can't all think alike on everything. And the difference between core theology and practical application of practices and policies should be a very careful and important distinction if we're going to be effective in all our world fields. There's no reason, there's no intent on those of us who are advocates of ordaining women who God has called to ministry in Central Africa. There's no reason to impose it there. I wouldn't want that to be done. I wouldn't want that to be done in South America in places where it would be a scandal. All I think is necessary is that the church recognize that this is not a core theological issue. It doesn't even have good theology behind it. It really should be in the domain of the practice that the people in the local territory understand best how to do.
yeah, amen. Well said. If you look at Adventist history, whenever they've come to this moment where there seems to be the officials trying to change the map or make the map more black and white, um, Adventism seems to be unique in a kind of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of process. The loop is just drove me crazy watching it all my life and then researching it and seeing that it's been going on since day one. But the officials, we're terming them the officials, if if they succeed in the next general conference election and maintain power, that's a bit bleak, wouldn't you say, for those that have got an optimistic view of what women ordination could be, or women in ministry could be?
Yes. Yeah, I would say it's bleak, especially at my age.
Yeah.
I really fully believe that within my professional lifetime, I would see women ordained, and that the energies would then go to other issues and other things, which to some degree is happening because there's really not the opportunity cost of putting a lot of energy into that isn't what it used to be. It used to be that you could move the needle. Right now, it's not going to move under the current conditions. I hope it will I hope it will in my lifetime.
Mm.
I may have to become a centenarian for that to happen, and that's
Uh,
okay. I hope it happens faster than that. The opportunity to help women in ministry on a practical local level, and all of us who are interested in supporting them being able to make connections for them, finding mentors for them, giving them the benefit of our hard-earned experiential learning, which some of them have, but lots of them haven't had that opportunity yet. We can do that. We can
mm,
do all of that.
Mm.
regardless of what officialdom does.
And have been for decades and
Hmm.
decades.
Yes.
Yes, and look, I think that's why it's so important that before the vote, the leaders who support women's ordination, in my humble opinion, should come public and say that they do, just to give a sense of hope. Because imagine if the officialdom that is currently in place returns, and um, this bleakness descends and begins to marinate the church at its grassroots levels. Um, if they then speak up, they'll be reprimanded for it. They'll be warned, sanctioned. It'll be too late then. And I think women and men who support women's ordination and equality in the church, they will look at these leaders and go, "You had your chance and you didn't take it." What are your thoughts on that comment?
Back to the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. I think we need to find the spaces where we can do something. Eleanor Roosevelt, John Wooden. I can't name all the people who have said something similar. Great leaders who have said, "Don't let what you cannot do stop you from doing what you can do." And I think that's where our opportunity is to look for the places we can do something. Look
Mm,
for the places where there's enough flexibility to move something forward and do that. Um, the other thing, and I'm going to go back to my Einstein quote. We have a problem with coming at this as a straightforward argument because we seem to be stalemated on that. The fact that we don't have an ordination theology and can't actually construct one very well, using two different models of inspiration, which are both prominent in the church now, says to me we have to do something else. And I was not just disappointed in 2015, I was disillusioned.
interesting.
My heart hurt at the end of that general conference.
Mm,
And I heard myself saying, "Are you really an Adventist? Are you still really an Adventist?
mm, mm,
How can you do this when it's going in this direction?" Um, and I struggled with it for a few weeks, and there were lots of conversation. The I support Adventist, or let's say I support ordination of women in Adventist ministry Facebook page was very lively
mm,
in around GC 2015.
mm-hmm.
And one day I woke up with the realization that we needed to change the focus of the church in a different way. And I thought, what are the real priorities in ministry? What if we understood it would make a difference? And so I started writing and I started working on it, and eventually I created a Facebook page. I can't remember now if it's a page or a group, but it's called Adventist Priorities.
Oh,
And
okay.
it's a closed group, but I invite anybody who's interested to look it up
Ca-
and then make a request.
Can you maybe share the link in the comments later after our
Yes,
conversation?
I will do that.
Yeah, I'd love to join
Uh,
you if I
and I
was
realized,
allowed.
first of all, I'll give you it's three priorities. It's really very simple. It's Jesus first, not Jesus only. It's Jesus first because we call ourselves Christians. That means that Jesus Christ is our leader. And so, if that's who we are, then as Adventists, our whole theology and our practice should be centered around Jesus. And I'm not talking dispensationalism here. I'm talking, Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He came to reveal the Father. And if we take seriously what Jesus said, then we have to take that seriously. We know who God is because we know who Jesus is. So let's put that right at the center of the circle. That's the big black dot in the center of the target. It's the
Mm.
core. It's the ground of our being as Christians. Uh, and that should inform everything we say and do. Everything.
Mm.
Second priority is love matters most.
Mm.
Why? Because Jesus said so.
Mm.
Jesus showed it. He demonstrated it. He demonstrated that God is love so that his apostle said, God is love. So there, that's the next ring around the little black dot is the white ring that says love matters most. Love is the method of interaction that we're to use, again, in everything we say and do. Now I struggle with that because on Facebook I get some pretty lively discussions about Adventism, Christianity, truth, spirituality, and sometimes I find it hard to express love to somebody who is advocating something that appears to me to be completely non-biblical and coming from the world that we're supposed to be out of,
Mm.
in but not of.
Mm.
So I challenge myself with this priority. Love matters most. It means even when I'm having a hard discussion, a crucial conversation,
Mm.
sometimes I need to take a deep breath and I need to go like, how would Jesus do
Mm.
this?
Mm.
And I challenge myself with that because that's getting down where the rubber meets the road. If we really did that, our conversation would be different than what it has become. Then the third priority is ministry is service.
Mm.
In this whole conversation about women in ordination, we have used the wrong map. And this is where it's really clear to me that we've used the wrong map because we keep talking about power and authority and power over and women having authority over men and all this. That's not the map of ministry. Jesus gave us the
Mm.
map of ministry.
Mm.
It's an upside down organizational chart
Yes.
where Jesus is at the bottom. He supports the apostles. The apostles support the next group of people, the disciples, and the disciples go to the whole world. And everything supports up to the larger group. In the upper room, Jesus showed us what ministry is. It's getting down on the floor with a basin of water and washing people's dusty feet.
Yeah.
It's
Pastoral
not
care.
power over.
Mm.
So if we understood that ministry is service, and actually that's what the word means in the original language is service,
Mm.
servant. If we really had servant leadership, we understood Jesus first, love is most important, ministry is service. We wouldn't have the same old argument that we have
Mm. Mm.
had about women's ordination. We would say, what did Jesus do? What did Jesus say? How does love work? Love is far more demanding than the simple 10 commandments or the other rules, the 613 rules of the Old Testament. Love is simpler, but it's way more demanding. It it says, how far can you go to lift up the kingdom of heaven? How far can you go to reveal the kingdom of heaven? How far can you go in your relationship and conversation to get people to feel God's love in your presence? Because that's what changes hearts.
Mm. Oh, I love that you've said those three things. Another golden sharing in this conversation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Um,
That actually changed my experience from coming out of GC 2015. Once I
yeah,
got that
okay.
figured out, it was like, if we can change the conversation, there's hope. And it's hope for much more than this issue. It's really hope for the church in North America and the rest of the developed world. There's a current book that's really challenged me. It's called Irresistible by Andy Stanley. And I don't go along with everything Andy Stanley says, but he brought me back to these priorities. He brought me back to remembering that Jesus is the core of Christianity, and that his words and his teachings are, and his example are the standard
Mm.
by which our life as a church are to be shaped. And if we do that and we become servants to the world and we become lovers to the people in the world, and we are the conduit for God's love being expressed in all those inventive new ways that God keeps bringing up to get to people in new circumstances, the Christianity could be irresistible again instead of
Mm.
becoming a source of confusion at best in the
Is that
public sphere.
is he an Adventist author?
No, I
See,
believe he's a non-denominational pastor.
um, see, Jesus wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist, and
Right.
I
He
left.
wasn't a Christian either, by the way.
I
He was the leader of the way. And in the
Yeah.
public sphere, I don't identify as a Christian or an Adventist. I identify as a follower of the way of Jesus.
Mm, mm. And
And
I
so I'm a non-parochial Adventist.
oh, I like that. Where you and I had a different reaction to that time. Um, I was watching the no vote on YouTube, and I started late in life, and I'm sitting there with my 2-year-old daughter, and my disillusionment over the next 6 months or so turned into me leaving the church
Hmm.
based on that. And I've
Hmm.
since been able to follow those three things that you're talking about. Again, not perfectly, failing often, struggling, but I've managed to adhere to those kind of basic tenets of what Jesus taught outside the
Hmm.
church. And I don't encourage people to leave the church. And
Hmm.
I'm so pleased that you're sharing your willingness to have stayed and to still be able to reveal these beautiful gems of hope to people within the church. In fact, I encourage people to stay in the church and come to these kind of understandings to bring about positive change. Um, and you've just mentioned that book, Irresistible, that was influential, someone that's not even part of a denomination by the sounds. So it's
Yeah.
possible to follow these tenets, if we call them that, um, in, out, wherever. Um, at what point, though, does a system or the map giver, the captain of a ship, restrict one's ability to turn ministry into service as effectively as it needs to be to the individual that is offering the service? At what point does that become restrictive enough for the person to consider other options?
Um, the quick answer to that is when it shrinks their own spiritual life to the point where they are not a clear conduit for God's love to flow through. Now, my ministry as a chaplain with a behavioral health and addiction specialty means that I have conducted thousands of interfaith conversations with groups of people of mixed faith and no faith backgrounds. So I've had the opportunity to work with thousands of people who have some kind of struggle with their spiritual life or their spiritual background, and particularly in relationship to healing and recovering from mental health and addiction problems. And I've observed the same thing across the spectrum with people in different denominations and different, completely beyond denominations, different forms of religion, that all organizations hurt people. It's just the nature of organizations. There's an old Native American story about a buffalo uh, that is leading a wounded mouse to healing waters, and he says to the mouse as they begin the journey. He says, I can help you get across the prairie to the mountains where the healing waters are. You'll have to stay in my shadow because if you're in my shadow, the eagles will not see you. And that's how I can protect you if you stay in my shadow. But as you walk in my shadow, you have to be careful to stay out of the way of my hooves, because my hooves do not have eyes. When I heard that story, I heard it in the oral tradition before it was in a book. When I heard that story, I went like, ah, my head exploded. It was like,
Yeah.
yes, this is
Wow.
human organizations, whether it's a
Yes.
tribe
Yeah, I love it.
or a church or a community, even families, big families.
Mm.
We do things as a group that sometimes hurts individuals. It's not because the buffalo's bad. It's not because of bad intentions. It's because the nature of organization, the nature of groups for the good of the group progressing and moving forward sometimes steps on each other,
Mm.
and it hurts. And if instead of condemning each other for the hurts that we have, if we could see things that way, we could maybe stay in the tribe, that group, that church, that community longer than if we demonize the source of the hurt. But some people have been stepped on so hard, they have been damaged so badly by the organization that they're not able to make use of that organization as a protector or a guide for their journey. They simply can't. Their response is, I just can't.
Yeah.
And when we are at a point of, I just can't be blessed in that environment, then it's not only okay to leave, it's healthy to leave. And when someone does that, I hope they find an environment where someone else in another place can become a guide, or at least a companion, at least a support to them. And so when we lose the capacity to grow spiritually in the place we're in, we need to move. We need to cross the border and find another place. We need to be immigrants.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing is that I've seen people who do this, who come into treatment. They say, I really need to grow spiritually. Where should I go? And I will point them to the place that would be most receptive and helpful to them. I've had people come back to me in a couple of years and say, well, I think I've gotten all I can out of that group. Where can I go now? I need a little more of this. And I will say, well, here's 2 or 3 groups that have more of this that you need next.
I like
And
it.
I've seen people do that 3 times as they move and cross boundaries to grow in their spiritual journey. God is not limited by those boundaries. We created those. They're human-made boundaries. God pours love throughout the world. He used magi to find the baby Jesus. He's used all kinds of people and still does. And one of the other maybe difficult learning experiences I had, which really opened my mind to how ministry works, is that I once thought, I believe I was trained to think, that the pastor is the spiritual guide for individuals in the church. That's a heavy burden. And that means that when somebody can't relate to their pastor very well, it's not a very good situation. Then I studied the work of the Holy Spirit, because I wasn't taught much about that in Adventism. I was taught about all the things to avoid. Don't do that woo stuff. Don't do that. Don't do that, But I really wasn't taught much about the work. So I studied it for myself. I had to find my own study, because there was no Bible study guide to follow for that. And when I studied the work of the Holy Spirit, I found that just like Jesus had a particular task to do in God's work, the Holy Spirit has a particular task. And one of those tasks is to be the spiritual guide for every person through their journey, through their whole lifetime. When I realized that, I just went like, my job as a pastor, my job as a chaplain is to companion someone, to listen well enough to their story, to hear their experience well enough to be able to say, "Oh, I see where you are on this map. I wonder if the next step you need to take is this." And if I do that well enough, I'm accompanying them or companioning them, perhaps guiding a little bit, that one step of the journey. But the Holy Spirit has their whole lifespan in sight. And I can trust the Spirit to take care of next week, next month, next year, after I'm gone, all of that. All I need to do is be in the presence of this person, fully in their presence, fully receiving the experience of the kingdom of God, which is among you now, and bringing that into their life at this moment so they can take the next step they need to make.
Mm.
That freed my ministry up
Mm.
tremendously once I discovered that.
It's using the map analogy. You then become a signpost, not necessarily the whole map or the
Yes.
path in every way. It
Yes.
also liberates the person to follow their own heart as well, and to grow into their own person, and seek and follow their own journey as it is supposed to unfold for them.
And for them to tune into the Spirit for themselves,
Yeah.
because
Mm.
the Spirit's always ready.
Yeah. Hey, I think that's a great moment to pause this conversation. I'd love to chat with you again down the track, but I've really valued talking to you today, Glenn, and the many insights that you've shared have been much appreciated. And I think, particularly in regard to this conversation, I think you've really contributed in a really valuable way. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation. I've really enjoyed talking with you and your stimulating questions.
It's been wonderful. Um, just a quick plug for those of you that are watching, click that love heart in the Facebook group and let people know that you've enjoyed this conversation. I can see some love hearts rising up already. A quick plug for tomorrow, 11:30. So we've got Alyssa Milne coming on. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. She is very, what's the word, articulate about her views on this topic in a cut to the chase, kind of get to the point in a magical way. So I'm looking forward to my conversation with her in the morning. And at 3:30 in the afternoon, I'm having a stimulating conversation with Peter Marks. I'm very much looking
Mm.
forward to that as well. And to those that are watching, please click the like button or the subscribe button. And if you have some loose change and you're enjoying the conversations that I'm presenting here into season 4 now, this is episode 5 that we've had today with Glenn. If you're interested in supporting what I do, even just send me the value of a coffee into my PayPal there, paypal.me/Peter Dixon Music. I'm following the ancient tradition there, Glenn, of the musicians busking and putting their guitar case out on the street and saying, if you're enjoying the music, please throw some coins. And I'm
Yes.
just saying, if you're enjoying the music, throw some coins into my PayPal account. It'd be greatly appreciated.
I will chat with you afterwards about how to do this, but I will be happy to put the Adventist priorities material that I've written, and there was something else I thought of earlier too. So
Well, I'd
let
love
me
you to
know
get in.
whether that should go in a conversation here or in a document form that you can post somewhere.
What would be great is if we put it into this conversation, if you can post it in the comments, that's where a lot of people will be engaging with this conversation. And then over at
Okay, I
Voice,
don't know where to do that.
when
I can
when
read
you
others' comments, but I don't see a
at
comment
the
box.
moment, we're in a different platform
Okay,
that's sending to those two groups. So
okay.
sorry to YouTube and Facebook. So what
And
I'll
I do want to say hello to the people that I know who are out there.
Yes, you've had
Uh,
lots of comments from people saying
the
hello
Yeah,
that know
and all
you.
they're identified as is Facebook user or
I
Parade
know,
Orange.
I know. We've got
So
John Tangen.
yeah,
Who else? There's been a few comments of people that know you. So what I'll do is I'll tag you in the comments, and then that
good.
you just click that, and you'll go straight to the conversation. And if you put any links that you want people to see in there, and also
Okay,
send me some stuff, and I'll put it over at Voice as well. I'll post that in an actual post to
all
get some
right.
conversation going over there. Well, once again,
It's
thank
really
you
nice to
very
time
much.
travel with you. It's only Wednesday
Yes,
night where I am.
I know. We're in your future. We're from your future.
Yes, I have
Would you
been to
like
the
me
future and I like it.
would you like me to tell you the lotto results for today? For your tomorrow?
Yes.
It works well with the stock market, actually. I watched the closing bell of the New York Exchange the night before
Oh,
because it always
yeah,
influences the opening of our market.
right.
There's a sneaky little tip for anyone interested.
hmm
Until next time, Glenn, thank you so much. We'll see you
You're
soon.
welcome. Good to be with you. And